The phone vibrated relentlessly in my pocket, a harsh reminder that I was not alone in my thoughts. It cut through the stillness of the afternoon like a knife, dragging me out of the quiet rhythm I had carefully settled into. Sweat clung to my brow as I wiped it away, trying to steady my nerves. The clinic, though modest, was a haven of sorts, a quiet place where I could focus on what really mattered, healing the sick, helping where I could. The world outside was wild and untamed, but here, for a fleeting moment, there was peace. The midday sun beat down relentlessly, casting long, heavy shadows across the dirt roads of the small village. I could hear the hum of insects in the air, the rustle of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But the phone kept buzzing, as if it too was desperate for my attention. I stepped outside, my shoes crunching on the gravel as I walked to the shade of a nearby tree, hoping the quiet would give me space to think. The name that flashed across the screen made my stomach churn. Richard. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen, trying to decide if I should answer. After all, it wasn't the first time I'd received a call from him, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But there was something about the way his name appeared, bold, demanding, that stirred a knot in my gut. I'd learned long ago to expect nothing good from these calls. But still, something inside me, curiosity, maybe a foolish hope, urged me to pick up. "Hello," I managed, keeping my voice steady, neutral. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of hearing any emotion slip through. "Hey, Catherine." His voice was as cheerful as ever, far too cheerful for someone who only ever called when he had something to say that he knew would upset me. I gritted my teeth but forced a smile. "What's going on, Richard?" "Just thought you'd want to know," he began, his voice smooth, almost too casual. "I've sold the mountain cabin." I froze, feeling the blood drain from my face. I gripped the phone tighter, as though I could somehow hold onto the shards of control I still had left. "You did what?" He repeated it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his tone unchanged. "Sold it." My mind raced, scrambling to process the words. That cabin wasn't just a house, it was home. It was a sanctuary, a place I'd poured years of love and effort into. And Richard? He had no claim to it, no right to decide its fate. "Don't look so shocked," he added with a smug chuckle, completely unfazed by the fire his words had ignited in me. "It's for the greater good. Mine, obviously." I felt the heat rising in my chest, a mix of fury and disbelief. How dare he? How could he think he could just sell it? The cabin was mine and Laura's. It wasn't his to touch. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "You had no right," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Oh, relax," he drawled, his voice dripping with the same condescension that always made my blood boil. "I've been managing things around here while you're off saving the world. And besides," he added with a self-satisfied laugh, "what's the point of holding on to something you're never around to enjoy?" It was an easy way to clear my debts. "You'll thank me later." The nerve, the audacity, my fists clenched at my sides. "I'll thank you when hell freezes over," I shot back, slamming the phone down before he could say another word. I stood there, phone in hand, chest heaving as I fought to regain control. The rage that surged through me was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't afford to let it take over. Not yet. I had to think, to plan. Richard thought he could get away with this, that he could sell something that wasn't his without facing any consequences. But he was wrong. I wasn't the same person I had been when I was a teenager, when I let him manipulate me, when I was too afraid to stand up to him. I wasn't that scared girl anymore. I was stronger now, strong enough to fight back. I turned and paced, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. He had crossed a line, and this time I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The cabin wasn't just a house. It was a part of me, a lifeline when everything else seemed to fall apart. And I would fight for it with everything I had. Richard had no idea what he was up against. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear even though the conversation had ended. My mind was racing, a blur of disbelief and mounting anger. The cabin, the place where I had spent countless summer afternoons with my mother, The place where I found peace after long, grueling work trips. Gone. Sold. Without so much as a second thought. The fury bubbling inside me threatened to overflow. How could he? How dare he? I had been away for months, volunteering in the most remote corners of the world, doing my part to make a difference. I gave everything I had to the people who needed it most, and here I was, being blindsided by the one person I should have been able to count on. Richard, my stepfather, the man who had wormed his way into our lives with charm and ease, only to reveal time and time again that his true nature was nothing more than selfishness wrapped in a thin veil of affability. The call had shattered everything. My stomach churned with the realization that I had been so naive, so trusting of him. I had allowed him to stay in my life for so long, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he would change. But no, Richard had only been getting better at hiding his true motives, at using his manipulative charm to keep me at arm's length while he took what he wanted. And now the cabin had been mine and Laura's, not his. Couldn't let this go. Not this time. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and dialed Laura's number. My fingers trembled as I pressed the screen. "Hey, Kathy, what's up?" Laura's cheerful voice crackled through the line, but I could barely make out her words. The rage bubbling inside me spilled out before I could even stop it. "Richard sold the cabin?" I blurted out, my voice shaky with a mixture of anger and disbelief. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear Laura's sharp intake of breath. "He what?" she asked, her tone dropping to one of concern. "Apparently, he needed the money to pay off some gambling debts. He thinks he can do whatever he wants, but I know our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority to sell it without your consent." Laura let out a low whistle, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He really thought he could get away with this? That man has no shame." "None," I agreed, pacing in a circle now, my mind reeling with the thought of Richard's audacity. "I'm going to need your help to sort this out. I'll finish up my assignment here and come home as soon as I can. In the meantime, can you pull up the legal documents? I need to be ready to counter this when I get back." "You've got it," Laura said firmly. "We'll take care of this together." Her words were a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. I wasn't the scared teenager anymore. I was an adult and I had the law on my side. Richard had no idea what he was up against. Before I hang up, I want to ask you, my amazing viewers, what would you do if someone tried to take something you loved, something you built with your own hands? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. The moment of truth is coming, and you won't want to miss it. Stay tuned. The anger was still simmering beneath the surface as I sat back down on the edge of my cot, phone in hand, trying to gather my thoughts. Richard had crossed a line. He thought he could just waltz in and take something that wasn't his to take, something that meant everything to me. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't alone in this. Laura and I had made sure years ago that our ownership of the cabin was protected by legal documents, binding and unbreakable. As the hours ticked by, I found myself trying to calm the storm in my mind. But I couldn't. Not when I thought about the way Richard spoke so flippantly about something that had been my sanctuary. His arrogance was like a slap in the face, and I was done letting him get away with it. My fingers itched to get back to work, to start looking through the legal documents that would prove he was wrong. I needed something concrete to hit him with, something undeniable that would put him in his place. The next morning, I grabbed my laptop and logged into my email. I was determined to find the co-ownership agreement, the one that made it clear Richard couldn't sell the cabin without both of our signatures. I scanned through the files, my eyes searching for the right one, and when I found it, I could feel the weight of the document in my hands, even though it was just words on a screen. There it was, black and white, the truth. Richard had no claim to the cabin. He couldn't sell it without my permission, without Laura's. I felt a rush of relief, but it was fleeting. The thought of Richard's smug face when he realized he had made a huge mistake kept gnawing at me. He would never admit to being wrong. He'd twist things, make excuses, and try to weasel his way out of it. But this time I had the upper hand. and I wasn't about to let him off the hook. I called Laura again, her voice steady and reassuring as always. "I've got it," I told her, the sense of power growing as I spoke. "The co-ownership agreement is all here. He has no legal right to sell the cabin." There was a long pause on the other end before Laura spoke, her tone grim. "We've got him, Kathy. But we need to make sure we take the right steps. I'll pull everything together. Let's get this over with once and for all." We spoke for a few more minutes, hashing out the details of what needed to be done. I could feel the weight of the situation, the pressure of what was at stake, but for the first time I wasn't afraid. Richard's betrayal was one thing, but this was different. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. He could lie, cheat, and manipulate, but the law was on my side, and I had the documents to prove it. I took a deep breath and sat back, letting the truth settle in. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of property. I was fighting for my own peace of mind, for my right to stand my ground. Richard thought he could take everything from me, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. This was about reclaiming my life, my voice, and my dignity. As I prepared to face him, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. I was ready. Richard had made his move, but now it was my turn. And when this was over, he'd finally see that I was no longer the scared girl he once controlled. No, now I was the one in charge. The days leading up to my return home were a blur of action and determination. I kept my emotions in check, focusing on the work I had left to do. But in the back of my mind, all I could think about was the cabin, the betrayal, and what Richard had done. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not this time. With the co-ownership agreement in hand, I set about gathering everything I could to build my case. I sifted through emails, dug through old text messages, and pulled every document I could find that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the cabin wasn't his to sell. Each piece of evidence I uncovered felt like another weight lifted off my shoulders. The more I collected, the clearer it became. Richard had made a colossal mistake. As I sat there, piecing together the facts, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since I first signed that agreement with Laura. Back then, I had been naive, too trusting of people who weren't worth my trust. I never imagined I'd be in a position like this, fighting for something so deeply personal. But now, the truth was in front of me, and I had the power to protect what was mine. I couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence as I flipped through the pages. Richard thought he could bulldoze his way through, thinking I was too far away, too distracted with my volunteer work to fight back. He couldn't have been more wrong. This was my fight now, and I wasn't about to let him win. But I knew it wasn't enough just to have the evidence. I needed to be strategic. I needed to think several steps ahead like Richard always did, but in a way that didn't just win the battle, it would win the war. I called Laura again, my voice firm and resolute. "I've got everything we need," I said, tapping my fingers against the desk as I spoke. "But I think it's time we start planning how we're going to approach this. I don't want to give Richard any chance to wriggle out of it." "I've been thinking the same thing," Laura replied, her voice calm and collected. "Let's make sure we've got all our bases covered before you come back. We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us." We spent the next few hours going over the legal steps we would need to take, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. The plan was simple, but it was thorough. We'd make sure Richard knew we weren't backing down, and we'd hit him with everything we had. Legally, of course. As I finalized the details, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I'd spent so much time letting others dictate my life. First Richard, and then my own doubts and fears. But this was mine. This was my fight, my decision. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of my choices not as a burden, but as a source of strength. The day I'd been waiting for finally came. I packed my things, ready to leave the village behind and return home. My heart raced, but it wasn't out of fear. It was anticipation. The time for planning was over. Now it was time to take action. I wasn't going to let Richard think he could take what was mine without facing the consequences. And when I walked into that cabin again, it would be a victory, not just over him, but over all the years I had spent feeling powerless. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to unfold, pressed down on my chest, making each mile feel like an eternity. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every thought of Richard, of the cabin, and of what was waiting for me when I arrived. But this time, I wasn't the same person I had been when I left. I wasn't the scared teenager who let him manipulate me. I was stronger, more determined, and I had something he didn't. The truth. I pulled up to the cabin as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the familiar landscape. For a moment, I just sat there, looking at the place that had been a sanctuary for so long. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was a piece of my history, a reflection of everything I had worked for. And I wasn't about to let Richard take that from me. As I stepped out of the car, I could feel the tension building in my muscles. Richard was already inside. I could see the dim glow of light through the windows, and I knew he was waiting, probably expecting me to show up, unprepared, vulnerable. But he couldn't have been more wrong. I had a plan, and this time I wasn't backing down. I walked inside, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open, and there he was, sitting on the couch, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked as if he'd been expecting this moment, like he thought he had already won. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar false cheer. "Finally back to reality, huh?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What do you want, Richard?" I cut straight to the point, my voice calm but firm, something in me finally snapping into place. He leaned back, his arms folded across his chest, clearly pleased with himself. "I just wanted to check in," he said, his tone condescending. "Make sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, so there's no use crying over spilled milk, right?" My jaw clenched, and the anger I had carefully controlled all this time began to bubble to the surface. "Funny you should say that," I replied, my voice cool and steady. "Because as far as I can tell, it's not gone." His smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. "What do you mean?" he asked, though I could see the unease starting to creep into his expression. "Laura and I checked the ownership records," I said, my voice sharp now, cutting through the air like a knife. "The sale didn't go through. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you." There was a long pause, and I could see Richard's facade cracking. For the first time, the smugness in his eyes was replaced with something darker, something that looked a lot like panic. "That's ridiculous," he spat, his voice tight now. "The buyer paid in cash, and the paperwork's been handled. It's a done deal." "No, it's not," I countered, taking a step closer to him. "Laura and I co-own the cabin. Remember? Without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it's still ours." He let out a hollow laugh, but I could hear the edge in his voice. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he sneered. "Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. You don't know how hard I've had it, Catherine." I did what I had to do. I took a deep breath, the urge to lash out growing stronger, but I held it in. "You didn't do what you had to do, Richard," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You stole from me, and you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" He was quiet for a moment, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He didn't have the upper hand anymore. "Not with me. You've made your choices," I continued, my words calm, but heavy with meaning. "And now you'll have to live with them." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard shifted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a way out. But there was no way out this time. Finally, he stood up, his face dark with frustration. "You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you?" he asked, his voice laced with something that sounded like desperation. "You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Try me," I said, each word carrying the weight of everything I had been holding back for so long. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. He just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, before he muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the cabin. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had faced him, stood my ground, and held my own. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a rush of victory. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about me, reclaiming my life and my power. I had fought back and I had won. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, charged with something I hadn't expected, relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I had control again. Richard's tantrum was his last attempt to keep me in line, to keep me afraid of him. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The power had shifted, and for once, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. I took a deep breath and sank into the armchair by the fireplace, the warmth of the room filling the empty space where tension had once been. As the minutes passed, the adrenaline slowly began to ebb, and what remained was a quiet sense of triumph. Richard thought he could steamroll me, take away something so precious to me without a second thought, but he had underestimated how far I'd come. I wasn't that scared girl anymore, the one who let him win. No, I had fought back, and I wasn't about to stop now. Just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed again, breaking the stillness. It was Laura. I swiped to answer without hesitation, already knowing what she was going to say. "He left, didn't he?" she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Yeah," I replied, leaning back in the chair. I faced him. I told him it's over. He knows I'm not backing down this time. There was a pause, then a relieved sigh on the other end. "I knew you could do it, Kathy. You're stronger than you think." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized just how much I needed to hear that. But Laura had always been there, always believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. "I'm not done yet," I said, the fire returning to my voice. "We still need to make sure he doesn't try anything else. We have to lock this down for good." "You got it," Laura said, her voice full of resolve. "We'll handle it. You've got me and you've got the law on your side. He doesn't stand a chance." I smiled, the weight of the situation lightening with each passing second. "Thanks, Laura. I really don't know what I'd do without you." "We're in this together," she replied firmly as always. As I ended the call, a sense of calm washed over me, and I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the surrounding woods. The evening sky had turned a soft shade of pink, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the yard. Everything about this place, this cabin, felt like a piece of me, etched into the walls, the floors, the memories, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. I didn't know what Richard's next move would be, but I wasn't going to wait around and let him catch me off guard. We'd already been through too much, and I had no intention of giving up now. But as I stood there, looking out at the place I had fought so hard to protect, I couldn't help but feel proud of how far I'd come. For years, I'd let Richard have his way, pushed to the edges of my own life by guilt, by fear, by the expectations I thought I had to live up to. But not anymore. Now I was reclaiming what was mine, everything that had always been mine. The next day, Laura and I put our plan into action. We gathered all the documents we needed, making sure everything was in order. We weren't just going to let Richard walk away from this without facing the consequences. We were going to hold him accountable, and we were going to make sure the cabin, our cabin, stayed right where it belonged. But before we moved forward with everything, I couldn't help but feel a little thrill. The thought of Richard, clueless about what was coming next, filled me with a quiet satisfaction. He had no idea that he was about to face the consequences of his own actions, that everything he'd done to undermine me had only set the stage for his downfall. The following days felt like a whirlwind, each moment marked by a mix of nervous anticipation and determination. I kept myself busy, preparing for the next step, ensuring that everything was in place. The legal paperwork had been gathered, the plan had been solidified, and there was no turning back now. The thought of Richard's face when he learned we were going after him legally made me feel a strange sense of satisfaction. He had underestimated me, thinking that I was too far away or too distracted to do anything about his betrayal. But I had news for him. This wasn't over. Laura was there every step of the way, checking the documents, making sure we didn't miss anything. We even started reaching out to the necessary people: lawyers, real estate agents, anyone who could help us ensure that Richard's actions didn't stand. The more we worked, the more confident I became. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had the law on my side, and with Laura's support, I knew we would win. But no matter how much work we put into the plan, there was still this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't just fighting for the cabin anymore. I was fighting for something much bigger. My right to stand up for myself, to no longer let Richard's manipulations control my life. He thought he could push me around, but now I had a voice that wasn't going to be silenced. By the time everything was ready, I felt as if I were holding my breath, waiting for the final moment, the final showdown. Richard still had no idea what was coming for him. I knew it was only a matter of time before he would try something else, some last-ditch effort to save himself, but I was ready. We had the evidence. We had the truth, and we weren't going to back down. The night before I was set to meet with the lawyer, I found myself back in the cabin, standing by the fireplace once again. The warmth of the fire flickered in the hearth, but it wasn't enough to chase away the unease that had settled in my chest. The stakes had never been higher, and no matter how much I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was still a step ahead. But I refused to let that fear take hold. I had spent too long letting him dictate my life, too long letting him take from me what wasn't his to take. This time I was going to make sure he paid the price. And when it was all over, I would walk away from this stronger than I had ever been before. I picked up my phone and called Laura one last time before the meeting. Her voice was steady as ever, and I could hear the reassurance in her words. "You're doing the right thing, Kathy. We've got this. You've got this." I closed my eyes and let her words sink in, the calmness washing over me. "Thanks, Laura," I said, feeling the weight of everything slowly begin to lift. "Tomorrow we put an end to this." When I finally hung up, I stood there for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings. This cabin had been my refuge, my anchor, and it was mine to protect. Richard couldn't take that from me. No one could. The next day, everything moved faster than I had anticipated. I drove to the lawyer's office with a purpose, my mind focused entirely on the task ahead. Richard had no idea what he was about to face. I felt a sharp sense of clarity as I parked outside the building, ready to take the next step toward securing the cabin and my peace of mind. As I stepped into the lawyer's office, I could almost feel the weight of everything I had gone through these past few weeks pressing on my shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a shield, something that would protect me from the chaos Richard had tried to create. The lawyer was waiting for me, a calm and professional presence that helped steady my nerves. "We've got all the documents you need," he said as soon as I walked in, motioning for me to sit down. "The evidence is solid. We're ready to move forward with this." I nodded, taking a deep breath as I slid the stack of papers across the table. "Let's do it," I said, my voice firm, even though my heart was racing. This was it, the moment when everything I'd worked for would either fall into place or crumble apart. But I wasn't about to let it fall apart. Not now, not after everything I had done to get to this point. As the lawyer started going over the details of the case, I found myself replaying the events in my mind. The phone call from Richard, his smug tone, the realization that he had sold the cabin without my consent. And yet, I had to admit, I wasn't just fighting for a piece of property anymore. I was fighting for myself, for the person I had become over the years, the person who had learned to stand up and take control when life tried to knock her down. Minutes turned to hours as we discussed the legal process, making sure every detail was covered. We were preparing for the possibility that Richard would try to push back, that he might attempt to manipulate the situation or lie his way out of it. But I had something he didn't: integrity, the truth, and a plan. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. By the time I left the lawyer's office, I was filled with a quiet sense of confidence. Everything was in motion now, and Richard had no idea that his little scheme was about to be unraveled. As I drove back to the cabin, I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you know you've done everything right, when you've taken the necessary steps to ensure that what's yours stays yours. When I got home, I immediately called Laura to update her. Her voice was as steady as ever, offering words of encouragement. "You're on the right track, Kathy. she said. Richard won't know what hit him. I hope so, I replied, smiling despite the tension in my chest. But I won't rest until it's all over. We spoke for a few more minutes, making sure we were both aligned on what needed to happen next. We were a team, and no matter what Richard tried, we would stick together. And we had the law on our side. I couldn't ask for better backup. Later that evening, as I sat by the fireplace in the cabin, the weight of the past few weeks started to sink in. I'd been through so much already, and there was still more to come. But I wasn't scared anymore. Richard's antics no longer held power over me. The cabin, this place that had been my refuge for so long, was finally going to be safe again. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the peaceful surroundings. The trees were still and quiet, the air crisp and fresh. And in that moment, I realized something important. This battle wasn't just about winning a legal case or protecting property. It was about reclaiming my own peace, my own voice. It was about taking back control of my life and refusing to let anyone, especially Richard, take that from me. The days that followed were a mixture of anticipation and quiet confidence. I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor, each step taking me closer to the end of this battle. The paperwork was in order, the legal path was clear, and I had everything I needed to ensure that Richard's deceit didn't stand. The truth was on my side, and there was no way I was letting him get away with what he'd done. But even as everything seemed to be falling into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't done yet. He had a way of sneaking out of tight spots, of finding cracks in the system that no one else could see. Still, I reminded myself that this wasn't the same me he had manipulated before. I had the law, I had my voice, and I wasn't backing down. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest set of legal documents Laura had sent me, the phone rang. I didn't have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. Richard. His number had become synonymous with chaos in my life, and I had no doubt that this time would be no different. I picked up the phone, my grip tightening instinctively. Catherine? Richard's voice came through the line, smooth and dripping with false politeness. I've been thinking about this whole cabin situation. I've been more than fair with you, don't you think? I almost laughed, but I kept my composure. Fair, I repeated, incredulous. You've been anything but fair. You sold something that didn't belong to you, without my permission, without Laura's. Richard let out a heavy sigh, almost as if he were the one wronged in this situation. Look, I'm not saying I didn't make a mistake, but you have to understand, the debts were piling up. You weren't here. What was I supposed to do? I was silent for a beat. The nerve of him. How many times had I heard this same excuse, dressed up in a new story? How many times had I been expected to overlook his selfishness, his disregard for anyone else's needs but his own? No, Richard, I said, my voice firm. You chose your actions. You made your decisions, and now you'll have to face the consequences. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might back down. But then, in typical Richard fashion, he shifted the blame. You always think you know best, don't you, Catherine? Always so righteous. You've never had to deal with the mess I've had to clean up. It's not as easy as you think. His words were sharp, aimed at provoking me, to make me feel guilty for something that wasn't my fault. But I wasn't taking the bait anymore. I'm not here to make you feel better about your poor choices, I said coldly. I'm here to make sure you understand that you don't get to make those choices for me, or anyone else, any longer. There was a brief, bitter silence before Richard's voice broke through again, this time tinged with anger. You're making a huge mistake. You're going to regret this, Catherine. You really think you can just push me aside and take everything back like it's no big deal? I felt a rush of emotion, frustration, anger, and something else too, something like relief. Finally, after all these years, I was standing up to him, and it felt damn good. This isn't about what I'm taking back, Richard. This is about protecting what's mine. What's been mine all along, I said. And I don't regret anything. Not anymore. There was a final click as he hung up, leaving the line silent and empty. I stared at the phone for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking in. I'd done it. I stood my ground and didn't back down. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had taken control. Not just of the cabin, but of my future. The next morning, I called Laura again to let her know what had happened. She was on my side, of course, but there was something in her voice this time. A deeper, more serious tone. "We're moving forward with the cease and desist letter," she said, her words precise. "We can't let him think he's won. He'll get the message loud and clear." I felt the weight of those words. It's time. No more waiting. We worked together to finalize the legal documents, getting everything in order before sending it off. The lawyer reviewed the letter, confirming that it would send the message Richard needed to hear, that this battle was over, and he had lost. The letter was sent, and it was just a matter of waiting now. Richard had his chance to back down, but he'd pushed too far. The consequences of his actions were now unavoidable. The next few days were a blur, the tension lingering in the air like an electric charge. I could feel Richard's presence even though he wasn't around, the sense that he was still trying to worm his way out of this, trying to manipulate the situation in his favor. But he was out of tricks. The legal letter had been sent. The cease and desist had been filed. There was no going back for him now. The law was on my side, and Richard had nowhere left to hide. I spent the next day organizing everything I had, emails, documents, photos, anything that might serve as evidence to back up my claims. I wasn't about to let him get away with trying to sell what wasn't his. The paperwork was airtight, and I was prepared to take this all the way if I had to. In the meantime, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Richard had always been good at making things look simple, like he had everything under control. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Richard wasn't going to let this go without a fight. The question was, how far was he willing to go? As I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the pile of documents, my phone buzzed again. My stomach dropped when I saw the name on the screen. It was Richard. I hesitated for only a moment before picking up. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever he was about to say, but I knew I had to face him head-on. He had already tried to play his games, tried to use guilt to manipulate me. Now, he was going to have to deal with the consequences. "Catherine," Richard's voice came through the phone, smooth and familiar, but this time there was an edge to it. "I've been thinking, and I want to make things right. I know things got out of hand, but we're family. I'm willing to work something out." I almost laughed. "Work something out?" I repeated, incredulous. "You've been trying to sell my property behind my back, and now you want to work something out?" "It's too late for that, Richard." There was a slight pause on the other end. Then Richard's voice lowered. "I'm not going to just let this go. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? You've always looked down on me, Catherine. Always acting like you know what's best for everyone, but you don't have a clue." I could hear the anger in his voice, the venom lacing his words. This was it, his last-ditch effort to make me feel guilty, to make me doubt myself. But I wasn't falling for it. "I'm not the one who made a mess of everything, Richard," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You did. And now you'll have to face the consequences. You don't get to take what isn't yours, and you don't get to manipulate me anymore. I'm done letting you control my life." There was a long silence, the kind that felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Richard didn't speak right away, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was realizing the reality of what he'd done. But then, his voice came through, tight and strained. "You don't know what you're doing. You think this is over? You think I'll just walk away from everything I've worked for? You're wrong, Catherine. I'll make you regret this." The words sent a chill down my spine, but they also steeled my resolve. He was trying to intimidate me, to scare me into backing down, but I wasn't going to let him. I had fought for this, fought for my peace, and I wasn't going to let him take that from me again. "Go ahead, Richard," I said, my voice unwavering. "Try me. You've already crossed the line. There's no going back now. This ends here." He hung up on me, and the sound of the line going dead echoed in the quiet cabin. I sat there for a long moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air. But I knew what had to be done. I couldn't back down now. There was no turning back. I had made my stand, and I was going to see this through to the end. I took a deep breath and walked over to the window, looking out at the landscape that had been mine for so long. The cabin, the woods, the quiet solitude. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let Richard take it from me. Not now, not ever. The next day I called Laura. "It's time," I said, my voice steady. "We're taking the next step. Richard thinks he can scare me into giving up, but he's wrong. We're doing this." Laura's voice was firm and reassuring. "I'm with you all the way, Kathy. We've got this. Let's finish this once and for all." The next steps were clear. We would take Richard to court if we had to. We'd make sure the cabin stayed in our hands, where it belonged. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The next few days felt like a test of patience and strength. I couldn't afford to make a misstep now, not when we were so close to seeing this through. With every passing hour, I could feel the weight of Richard's threats lingering in the back of my mind. But I knew better than to let his intimidation tactics derail me. I was no longer the person who let him control the narrative. This time, I was the one writing the ending. The legal team was hard at work, reviewing everything, double-checking the documents, making sure we had a solid case. I spent hours with them, going over each detail, making sure everything was airtight. I wasn't leaving any room for him to exploit. I was prepared for any fight he threw at me. But the more I worked, the more I realized just how much Richard had underestimated me. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about my life, my boundaries, and my right to take control. Richard had always seen me as easy prey, someone he could manipulate, someone he could push around when it suited him. But now I wasn't that person anymore. I had changed, and I was done letting him dictate the terms. Laura and I were more than just partners in this legal battle. We were a team, bound by a friendship that had withstood so much over the years. She checked in with me daily, making sure I was holding up, offering advice and support whenever I needed it. Her unwavering belief in me was a lifeline I held onto tightly. Finally, the day arrived when it all came to a head. The legal team was ready. The documents were finalized. We had everything in place to bring Richard to justice. The cease and desist letter had already been sent, and now it was time to take the next step. I stood outside the cabin, taking in the familiar sights, the place that had once felt like a safe haven. It was still mine and Laura's, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that from me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over me, feeling the weight of everything I had fought for, everything I was about to reclaim. The phone rang, and I knew it was Laura. I answered it immediately, my heart racing with anticipation. "We're ready," Laura said, her voice steady and calm. "It's time to take him down." I nodded, a sense of determination flooding through me. "Let's do it. He's not going to get away with this." The battle had reached its final stage, and I was ready for whatever came next. We'd done everything we could to ensure that Richard's actions wouldn't go unpunished. Now it was time for him to face the consequences of his choices. As I made my way to the courthouse, my mind was a whirl of thoughts. But through it all, one thing remained crystal clear. I wasn't backing down. Richard had no idea what he was in for. I had the law on my side, and I was prepared to fight for everything that mattered to me. Walking into the courtroom, the weight of the situation settled over me. Richard sat on the other side, his usual smug expression in place, but I could see the nervousness beneath it. He was trying to act confident, but I could tell that, deep down, he knew he was losing. This was no longer his game to control. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my composure. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. Richard's lawyer spoke first, trying to defend his client's actions, but every word he said only made the truth clearer. The documents, the evidence, everything was lined up against Richard. There was no room for him to wriggle out of this one. Then it was my turn. I stood tall as I presented the case, carefully laying out the facts, showing how Richard had sold the cabin without our consent, how he had lied, and how he had tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of the truth behind every word. This wasn't just about property. It was about taking control of my own life and standing up to the person who had made me feel small for so long. When the judge spoke, it was clear. The sale of the cabin is invalid. The property remains under the co-ownership of Catherine and Laura. Any further attempt to sell or transfer ownership is illegal and will result in legal action. The gavel came down, and I could feel the flood of relief wash over me. The victory wasn't just in the ruling. It was in the realization that I had finally won, not just for the cabin, but for myself. Richard had lost, and for the first time in years I felt free. As I left the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. It wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine. And with Laura by my side, I knew this was just the beginning. There were no more shadows in my life. No more manipulations. I was in control, and nothing could take that away from me. As I walked out of the courthouse, the weight I had been carrying for what seemed like forever began to lift. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher, and every step felt lighter than the last. The battle was over, and for the first time in years, I could breathe deeply, without that nagging feeling of being watched or controlled. I had won not just the cabin but something far more significant. I had reclaimed my peace, my independence, and my right to decide what happened in my life. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I dialed Laura. The moment the call connected, I could hear her excitement in her voice, even before I said a word. "We did it, Kathy. You did it," she said, her voice thick with relief. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, a smile spreading across my face. "Thank you for sticking by me through all of this. You've been my rock." "No need to thank me," Laura said with a soft laugh. "We're in this together. Always have been." We talked for a while, making plans to celebrate the victory, but as I listened to her voice, I couldn't help but think back to everything I had gone through to get here. The quiet moments in the cabin when I'd been alone with my thoughts, the angry calls from Richard, the doubt and frustration that had been eating away at me. But now none of that mattered. The past was behind me, and the future, my future, was wide open. Later that afternoon, I stood in the cabin again, looking out at the familiar landscape. Felt different now. The trees, the sky, the mountain air. All of it felt like a fresh start. I could feel the cabin's energy shifting, from a place of tension and conflict to a place of peace and strength. This was no longer a battleground. It was home, my home. I took a moment to just sit there, taking it all in. The journey had been long, and at times, it felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. But now, as I looked out over the land that had been a constant throughout my life, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't just in the legal outcome. The real victory was in finding the strength to stand up for myself, to fight back when everything seemed stacked against me. I had grown in ways I hadn't expected, and I knew I was stronger now than I had ever been before. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the cabin, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let anyone, no one, ever take control of my life again. Not Richard, not anyone. I had learned to trust myself, to listen to my own voice and my own instincts, and it had brought me here, to freedom, to peace. A week after the court victory, I still couldn't quite believe that everything had finally come to an end. Even though Richard had lost the legal battle, I couldn't help but feel like the dust hadn't completely settled yet. There was something in the air, a kind of tension that hadn't fully dissipated. Every day that passed, as I woke up in the cabin I fought so hard to protect, everything seemed to come into sharper focus. It felt like a new chapter in my life had just opened, but there was still a lingering sense of unfinished business. Richard's loss was just the beginning. I knew that. He wouldn't give up so easily, especially not after the humiliation of losing in court. I had expected him to make a quick exit, but instead, I found myself waiting for the inevitable. His next move. The first sign came on a quiet afternoon. I was in the cabin, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, when I heard a car pull up outside. It was a sound I had become familiar with, a sound that had always made my heart race in the past. But this time I wasn't afraid. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee aside, and walked to the door. There, standing in the doorway, was Richard. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to expect. He looked different. Less smug, less confident than the man I had confronted in the courtroom. But there was still something dangerous in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "Catherine," he said, his voice cold but almost polite. "We need to talk." I didn't invite him in. I didn't have to. He stepped inside anyway, his presence filling the space with an uncomfortable tension. I crossed my arms, standing firm in the doorway. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about," I said, my voice steady, my heart still beating fast, but not out of fear, out of something else, something like anticipation. He gave a hollow laugh, clearly not expecting me to react this way. "You think this is over, don't you?" he said, pacing the room, his eyes scanning the walls like he was sizing up his next move. "You think you've won, but you're wrong. You've only won the battle, Catherine, not the war." I narrowed my eyes. "If you think for 1 second that I'm afraid of you, you're mistaken." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes sharp, calculating. "You think you've defeated me, but you've only pushed me into a corner. And when a man's backed into a corner, he does whatever it takes to survive." I wasn't sure if I should be worried or amused by his words, but I wasn't backing down. "I've already won, Richard. There's nothing you can do now." The silence between us stretched on, thick and heavy. Richard was trying to regain his composure, but I could see the cracks in his armor. For the first time in a long time, I was in control of this situation. "You have no idea what I've been through," he muttered, almost to himself. "You never understood me. You never even tried." I shook my head. "I didn't need to understand you, Richard. I just needed to stand up to you. And I've done that. Now you need to leave." He didn't move. "You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're messing with." "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." For a moment, I thought about the years I had spent letting him manipulate me, trying to appease him, trying to make everything work. But now that person was gone, and I wasn't going to let him turn me into someone else again. "Leave, Richard," I said, my voice low and steady. "You've lost, and I'm not scared of you anymore." I stood my ground, unwavering. For a long moment, he just stared at me, as if searching for a way to break me. But I wasn't going to break. Not now. Not ever again. Finally, he turned away, the defeated look in his eyes clear. "This isn't over," he said, his voice heavy with resentment. I didn't respond. I simply watched as he walked out, the door shutting behind him with a soft thud. As I stood there, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. This wasn't just a confrontation with Richard, it was a confrontation with myself. The person I had been, the person who let others walk all over her, was gone. And the person standing in that cabin now? She was someone who knew her worth. Someone who wasn't afraid anymore. The next few days were peaceful, almost eerily so. But I knew better than to think it was over. Richard would keep trying, I was sure of it. But this time I was ready. And whatever came next, I would face it head on, just like I had with everything else. I wasn't the same person who had been afraid to stand up for herself. And nothing, not even Richard, could change that. Days passed, and the unsettling calm continued. The silence of the cabin, once a comfort, now felt like an eerie prelude to something I couldn't quite shake. Richard hadn't made any moves since his visit, but I knew that wouldn't last. He was unpredictable, desperate, and cornered. The worst kind of combination. I spent my time reinforcing the sense of peace that had begun to take root in the cabin. I spent hours fixing up the garden, the same flowers I'd planted with my mom when I was younger. Each petal, each bloom, a reminder of a simpler, happier time. The task kept me grounded, but in the back of my mind, there was always that nagging feeling. I wasn't sure what exactly Richard was planning, but I could feel it in my bones. He wasn't done yet. The thought made me restless, my mind constantly turning over scenarios. What could he possibly do next? I knew he wouldn't simply walk away. He wasn't capable of it. One afternoon, as I was finishing up a fresh coat of paint on the porch, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out quickly, almost expecting to see Richard's name. But it wasn't him, it was a text from Laura. "I need you to come to the office. Something's happened." The anxiety that had been simmering inside me bubbled to the surface. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my keys and headed to town. The entire drive, my mind raced, imagining the worst. I was hoping for the best, but preparing for the possibility that Richard had pulled something else behind the scenes. When I arrived at Laura's office, she was pacing, her eyes filled with concern. As soon as I stepped through the door, she motioned for me to sit. "What's going on?" I asked, already dreading what she was about to say. "I've been going through some of the public records again," Laura began, her voice tight, "and there's something strange. Richard did more than just sell the cabin. There's a document I found in the county's system that suggests he's been trying to transfer ownership to someone else, a third party. He's been working on this behind the scenes, even after the court ruling." I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. I had thought we were done. I had thought the law was on our side. But this was different. Richard had found a way to push back, to keep fighting, to keep scheming. "So what's the plan?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear that was creeping up. "We need to act fast. I've already contacted the authorities," Laura replied. "But I think he's going to try to move fast. We'll need to track down who he's been working with, and we'll need to stop the transaction before it goes through." I nodded. I wasn't about to let Richard win again. Not after everything. Laura's phone rang then, interrupting the moment of silence. She answered quickly, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "Okay, yes. We'll be there soon," she said before hanging up. That was the real estate agent. Richard's buyer has been trying to finalize the sale. We need to get to them before they make it official. We wasted no time. We left the office and headed straight to the office of the real estate agent. Laura's voice was calm as she spoke with the agent, explaining the situation and presenting the legal documents that confirmed the sale was invalid. The agent looked surprised, but also willing to cooperate. I stood at the back of the office, watching as the agent made the call to halt the transaction. It was a surreal moment, the power of legal paperwork, the law, the finality of it all. I had fought for this, and now, with one phone call, it was all being taken away from Richard. But it didn't feel like a victory, not yet. As much as I wanted to feel relief, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't done. This was his last shot, his last attempt to gain control. He wasn't going to go down without trying every last thing. I turned to Laura, my voice low. "He's not going to give up, is he?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But now we've got the leverage. It's not over, but we've got the upper hand." I nodded, but something in me still felt unsettled. I didn't trust Richard. He had already shown me how far he was willing to go. The question now wasn't if he would retaliate, it was how. As I walked out of the office, the day began to feel heavier, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on me once more. I thought of the cabin, of the life I had fought to protect, and I knew I couldn't stop now. There was still one final battle left to win. I spent the next few hours in the cabin, pacing, reflecting, preparing. I had come so far, and I wasn't about to let Richard ruin everything I had worked so hard for. He had underestimated me before, and he would again, but this time I would be ready. The battle wasn't over, but I was stronger now, and I would make sure that Richard learned that lesson the hard way. Night fell, and I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth of the flames flicker around me. This place, this cabin, wasn't just my home. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for. And no one, especially not Richard, was going to take that away from me. It was just a matter of time before the final showdown, and I would face it head-on, no matter what it took. I had already won so much. This would be the last time Richard ever tried to take anything from me. The road ahead would be hard, but I was ready for it. The days after our confrontation at the real estate office were filled with tense waiting. I knew Richard wouldn't give up easily. He was too used to controlling the narrative, bending people to his will. But this time I had the law, and I had everything I needed to protect what was mine. The cabin was more than just a building. It was my sanctuary, my history, and my future. Laura and I worked relentlessly, gathering more evidence, ensuring that no legal loophole could be exploited. We tracked down every potential buyer Richard had been in contact with, stopping any attempts to finalize the sale before they could go through. I refused to let Richard's last-ditch efforts disrupt my peace. Then, one afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, I got the call. It was from the attorney handling the case. Richard had finally backed down. His last attempt to sell the cabin had been blocked, and his involvement in fraudulent activities had been reported. The real estate agent, once aware of the full scope of Richard's deceit, had stepped forward as a witness, ensuring that any future efforts to transfer ownership would be legally invalid. The relief that flooded over me was immediate but bittersweet. For years, Richard had manipulated my life, making me feel like I had no control, no voice. And now I had fought back, not just for the cabin but for my own dignity, my own strength. A few weeks later, after everything had been finalized, I found myself sitting on the porch of the cabin, the warmth of the evening sun against my skin. The cabin was exactly as it had always been, but now it felt different. It was a place of victory, of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I had fought for this, for the space to breathe, for the peace I had once lost. Laura joined me outside, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. We clinked our glasses together, celebrating not just the legal victory, but everything it represented. "We did it," I said softly, smiling at her. "I did it." "You did," she agreed, her voice full of warmth. "And you're stronger for it." Looking out at the landscape before me, I realized something important. The cabin had always been a place of refuge, but now it was a symbol of my resilience, of my willingness to stand up for what I believed in. It was a reminder that no one, not even Richard, could take away what was mine without a fight. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at home, not just in this cabin, but in my own life. No more fear, no more manipulation. I had taken control, and now I could finally live on my own terms. The journey had been long and filled with obstacles, but it had led me here, stronger, wiser, and free. As the evening sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle above, I knew that this was just the beginning. The chapter with Richard had closed, but my story was far from over. And for the first time, I couldn't wait to see where it would take me next.